But thank you all for coming, and enjoy the screening, and then afterwards we'll have RaMell Ross and Jheanelle Brown. Thank you.
I like this.
Yeah, and I like. Hello, thanks for staying and coming.
Another round of applause. Thanks y'all for being here and staying for this conversation, and thanks RaMell for being here.
I just got here and I broke mostly things. Sorry, I'm a little worried about my safety up here. All right, there you go. Yeah.
Hello. So, I think, and if folks have questions, just, put your hand up. Can you tell us a little bit about your relationship to Hale County, your relationship to the South, just because I think we're talking about Black subjects, we're talking about, we all just watched this, so we're talking about what is represented on screen, so I think it's really important to give folks a context of just what you're bringing to this personally and your relationship to it.
Yeah, that's important to know, sort of the point of view. Perhaps we know the historical relationship between, African-American population, Black folks like myself in the South. I think of it in terms of it being a sort of cul-de-sac for our history. And obviously there's a Black diaspora that spreads across the world, but sort of the conceptual relationship. My dad's from North Carolina, and so I spent a lot of time in the summers there with him. Aside from that, I grew up with a lot of stories about his life as a child, while segregation is, I guess, didn't really break up so fast, but integrating high schools and being chased by people. I don't know, it's weird when I every time I think of those stories, I just go to a dark place because the images, as a kid and your dad being like, yeah, so I was riding my bike and these guys are chasing after me in this car, and then they I run behind this telephone pole and they crash, and then I'm just like, what? Like, what are you talking about? But anyway, that's sort of my the stories my dad told, and then I grew up in Northern Virginia, so.
So one thing I was thinking about was, there's a point at which that classroom scene, they're talking about, one of the people are talking about stereotypes, they're talking about representation. And when I first watched the film, I thought maybe that you were kind of embedding a possible critique of the film or within it. And so I was also reading this article that you have in the New York Times from a few years ago, and I'll just read a quote and ask you to kind of expound on this. And this is about your earlier photographic project, South County. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay, so you said, in this project, South County, Alabama, the oldest image, Dakisha and Marquise, was made in 2012, as I wondered in a daydream's light how to unburden the African-American body and skin. The problem of representation had become a conceptual challenge. I wanted to engage the photographic narrative of the historic South, but provide its representation some breathing room and loosen the hold of the iconic meaning. So can you talk about unburdening, what that means to you in regards to your practice, what it means to you in regards to this film, but also what it means for Black skin?
Yeah, that's it's sort of the big revelation that I kind of think I had through making images, being really conscious of the potential reception of some of the, depictional elements of the image or the frame. I talk a lot about the relationship between, well, I'll ask this, so what would co-sign racism without photography and film? It's literally like partner. It's like its best friend, there's no image made in the entire world that wasn't in the zeitgeist of racism. Because when it was, 1860s and then, film, like it's just like they have parallel tracks. And so, to represent someone is to then put forth what is a fiction of their visuality, which is like too big of a philosophical problem because you can't deal with that on a daily basis because it's not reasonable. Like the visual field is embedded with all of this meaning that we're sort of forced to contend with, and we're sort of in some sense slave to it. But so when unburdening the image, the Black quote unquote body, to me is allowing there to be a multiplicity of interpretations for the person's like Blackness, or for the person's for the person. So, to me, I would take an image, like a portrait of someone in Alabama. This is like 2009. I'd take a portrait. And there are students that were in a GED program I was teaching in. And I look at the photo, and, any person that studies photography or thinks about the images, like understands that a portrait is of the person who's making the photo, not of the person who is in the photo. You're choosing this one instant based on your understanding of meaning, your understanding of what their personality could possibly manifest. And then you're putting forth this as to be this person. So I'm making an image of someone, and then I'm like, I can't imagine that anyone thinks anything new about this person. They think that he's a Black kid that lives in Alabama, that is in a GED program, and look at his expression. He's so sensitive, or he's so X, Y, or Z. It's like it doesn't contest the problem of calling the person Black and sort of foreclosing their potential or their language or their interest into like some sort of fundamentally true Black filter, which is like just not true. It just doesn't exist. And so like the first thing I did was I had all the students like write one word that described them on the image. These were like 4x5 large format Polaroids, and then that was like an intervention because not only so I made this image, but their language is on top of it. And so therefore, they have a little bit more control, and you can see perhaps a contradiction between the image and the word. And so I'm like, wait a second, there are ways to deal with this problem of just presenting someone in this sort of falsely created Black representational space. And then I started to play with myself, the Black person, in the landscape in like really ambiguous poses. And then what happened is they started to channel history. You would put someone, you lay someone down and do something, and you take the photo, and then you look at it, and there'd be, a reference to a YouTube video you saw of a person shot on the street. But then I'm like, wait a second, if this was a white person, it's not a reference. It's only a reference because the majority of images that we see of Black people are X, Y, and Z, and so we can't help but attribute certain gestures and certain language from a guy walking on the street really fast at us as, oh my God, this is terrifying. It's because it's all the films and shit and news we've seen. It's not actually a threat if that's a white person, and obviously I'm using it's super general what I'm saying, but to unburden to me means to like confuse or to put alternate versions of interpretation into our bodies in order to create a wider spectrum of possibility. Because, and I know I'm talking too long on this, but for me, like it's not that there are bad Black images, is that there's not enough Black images. Like if you make a film about white poverty, like, people aren't like, it's gonna be less of a problem because there's 1 million representations for white folks. And so Gummo is not a big deal. No one cares about Gummo. But because there's a history of white people making all this shit about Black bodies and Black people making all this stuff that's sort of now not condemning any image making, but that's now in a sort of capitalist place where you have to like push the Blackness, or you have to like reduce the narrative in order to prove something. There's just not that wide range that's part of the sort of white history. And so that's kind of what I mean by that.
So, I mean, what I take from that is the film is part of a larger practice of, one, subverting filmmaking as a medium, but also maybe two, historicizing like Black image making. I mean, that's part of what I'm getting from you. And so can you just talk a little bit more? So you mentioned the historical references that some of the subjects were invoking, and just sort of what you're doing with adding to, I guess, what could become an archive of Black images. Can you just talk a little bit more about what does what exactly are you historicizing? What things in the historical arc of Black folks, let's say in the United States specifically, are you in conversation with? Like, what's important to you?
There's not any specific images or any specific reference that's important, but to me, I think that there needs to be a sort of like Black involution in which Blackness becomes so complex that it's not a thing anymore. You know, I know that it's kind of abstract, huh?
It is abstract, and I'm also wary of Blackness being abstracted from itself. So yeah. I want to hear more about what you're doing.
Maybe I'll backpedal, just for the safety of everyone in the audience. Not for me. I'm fast. I can run.
I really want to.
Well, I mean, it's not. These aren't like, fully fleshed out theses. These are just like, whimsical, ways to approach the problem of being image and the fundamental issue with Blackness. And I love being Black, and I think that people need to I think Blackness is the greatest thing ever. But I'm confronting the foreclosing of Blackness as it relates to estimating someone's potential, because I think that's where the problem lies for me. It's like, I don't think that when people see Daniel and Quincy, I don't think that they imagine them as their boss. Like, ever. Never crossed anyone's mind. And I think that, I'm not saying that when you see another person that you would imagine them as your boss, but Quincy and Daniel are farther on the list. And it's because of the way in which Blackness has been cultivated, imagined, reproduced, and disseminated throughout culture. All of the references, the majority of references are people draw negativity to Blackness, and that's just a consequence of it. And so I think by opening up the space of Blackness, by making Blackness complicated, by confusing Blackness, you allow for there to be less pitfalls and more space for people for Blackness to be something that has ambiguity. Like, the problem with the African American experience, I think, is that everyone thinks they know it. Everyone thinks they know what poverty is. They think they know what, growing up here or being a sports player or like all these things. You talk about them and people know, they've heard it, they've had the conversation, but you don't know it until you've lived it, And granted, it works for every single type of person from every single background, but I'm not that. I'm Black, so that's kind of what I'm interested in, And I think image making is the key. I think to me, there's like a perceptual problem where you have a visual field, you take something in, and then it goes through the socialization process into meaning. And I think that we can work through that space with images that confront that threshold right before it goes into the language that we use to describe what we've seen, by creating experiences of Blackness that have no place in the consumer's culture of Black images. Aside from now, where it's like you can make, an awesome Kendrick Lamar video and he's referencing all this stuff, or you can, now it's like great to make all these crazy Black images, but before no one really cared. And so that's kind of what I'm peddling in.
Blackness is one thing, but then another register at which we could talk about this would be Black masculinity.
Yeah.
And I also wonder, it just occurred to me, so RaMell and I both went to Georgetown for undergrad. We did not overlap, but as many of you know, Georgetown is known for its really good basketball team. I mean, I don't know how they're doing now, but
they're not. I mean, they hired Patrick Ewing, Patrick Ewing. Yeah, we'll see.
Yeah.
No promises.
But so there's this thing Georgetown, some people think Georgetown's a Black school before. That used to be the thing, boys in the hood, whatever. So there's there's a specific set, as I view it, of chattel expectations around Black men that are sports players, right? RaMell played basketball at Georgetown for a year or so.
5 years?
For all years. sorry.
No, it's cool.
I didn't.
I mean, apparently because I didn't start, I don't get. I'm just kidding. No, I was super injured.
I read an article. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I was on the squad though. I was like,
okay.
Cheering my homies on and like.
So you're basically like redshirt. You were on the.
I was redshirted so many times. I could have stayed 6 years, basically.
Okay. See.
Yeah.
Don't try. I know the lingo, y'all. But I'm wondering. So I asked a general question about black masculinity with relation to Hale County, but also like being a black man who played basketball at Georgetown. Like, yeah, it feels like a plantation sometimes, if I'm being honest with you. So I'm wondering, just kind of selfishly, if any of that like influenced how you, I don't know, thinking.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, us on the team are like, yes, massa, let's go.
Yeah.
That's how it is, because like, and it's a joke, but it's a clear reference, like we know that we're on scholarship and we're getting paid $50K a year to play, but we also know that Georgetown is branding the shit out of us. Like they're making so much money and they're building all this stuff, and I think the NCAA is gonna have a reckoning really soon. It's it's just kind of almost inevitable. But as it relates to the film, I think that it's the sort of origin point of the discomfort with having people walking around and looking at people and talking to people, and because you do a certain thing or you look a certain way, you are a certain thing and you are a certain way. I had a huge problem because I was on the basketball team, just like not being a basketball player. Like I didn't know whether or not a person was my friend because most of the time it was because they knew my stats. They're like, oh, you're on the, all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, I'm not really interested in talking about those types of things. There's a relationship to blackness in which you walk around and there's a sort of intersubjective thing that happens where there's some sort of familiarity with you before you've ever met them. And granted, that happens with everyone, but there's varying degrees of it. The masculinity is like really, really complicated. I wanted to like truly depict but like sort of translate the true way that these fellas were. And to me, what was striking about the masculinity is that they were way more sensitive than I expected them to be. And then therefore it's like kind of working against my own expectations, which is really interesting. Like, what's that guy's name? The New Yorker critic, Richard Brody. Richard Brody just wrote a review today of the film, which is really nice and really glowing. And he talks about how all of the shots the people are kind of abstracted and the world is kind of only rendered through my photographic whatever, And it's like a subtle critique, but he's saying that it works as a piece, but it's like, maybe documentary should be moving towards some other thing, or what if you would have done something else is kind of what's implied to me. But to me, in me recognizing the sensitiveness within, the sort of masculine culture that you see, the guys fighting, the guys throwing each other around and goofing around, the film is about like my process of looking, and then therefore participating in their lives and then translating that whole experience into a film, It's just as much about the way in which I see the world and the way in which I have to deal with myself as them and myself with them, given the history of the historic South, that's like, this sort of curtain that I've always looked through that like slowly gets to be peeled apart the longer you stay and the longer you look at something. And so the investigation into masculinity, I'll stop there.
Lime kiln field day. Can you tell folks just a little bit about the film? I can also jump in from what I know. And why'd you use that clip? Where you used it?
Lime Kiln Field Day Club, or Club Field Day?
Just Field Day.
Just Field Day?
Just Field Day.
You sure?
I just wikied it.
Okay. Wiki lies though. You can wiki it right now and you'll be like, this was edited 15 seconds ago.
That's too many words, so I'm gonna just assume it's Lime Kiln.
Yeah, I think it goes back and forth because I've seen it written as both on like official publications, and that's why I just don't say it.
That's what. Okay, yeah.
I'm just like, the Burt Williams clip. Yeah. So that film is a film that was an unfinished production from 1913, and it had an all-black cast. I think it had 3 official directors. I think 2 of the directors were white. 1 of them was black. I mean, this is incredibly rare. To even consider that is almost counterintuitive, given the times. And so there's like a couple white folks that end up in the film. Burt Williams, who's a Caribbean black man, is in blackface, and he's like the vaudeville, super famous, most highly paid, highly sought after sort of black actor of the times. He's the lead, and there's like 1 or 2 other people in blackface. But the beautiful thing is that it depicts, and it's 35 millimeter, of course, it depicts a middle-class existence and like a weird courting drama between Burt Williams and a couple other characters. And it's like a little bit slapsticky, it's silent. Burt Williams is doing his face thing, and there's like a couple, overly gestural things. But it's like just so. And actually, yesterday at BAM, we watched the movie I just told you in the thing, and we had a piano accompaniment of the film, and it's like devastatingly strange to watch it because it just doesn't make sense. We understand black and white footage from that time, and that having a very specific, visual, behavioral, cultural relationship between the people in it, and it's so strange. But anyway, I had an opportunity to watch it via Rohindra Roy. He's a curator at MoMA, and that part many parts stood out to me, but that part specifically because never in the film was it like an isolated scene in which he was like moving through something and then like looking into something, like that's a pretty open gesture. So it seemed to fit really well with that plantation shot. And then it just makes obviously the scene incredibly complex. And yeah, the scene's up to interpretation, but I think a couple of people have written about it, and I've talked about it online, so I won't bore you guys with that. But it's like the only kind of cut. What kind of cut do they call it? Like it's the only continuity cut in the film. Continuous cut in the film, and it's for a reason. There's like a lot of time conflation and historical stuff.
Can you talk more about time? And also, I think kind of it could relate to a discussion about the inner titles. Like, a lot of the inner titles that you use there's a conversation around temporality that's happening. So could you just talk more about those things?
Yeah. You go to a place, and this is all over the world, so I'm not saying that the Historic South is specific in this instant, but it is idiosyncratic in its relationship to the U.S. You go to a place like the historic South, and there's like this, not even time conflation. It's like time. It's like the past. Like it is still now in a way that's like really unnerving. You can see it in people's faces, but I don't know if this is me talking. I don't know if I'm projecting onto them or whether or not it's actually in their face. How do you really know these things? You can feel it in the air. I don't know if it's the stories I've heard as a child, the books that I've read, but I feel it, and a lot of people feel it when they go that even aren't from the U.S. And it really, to me, immediately threw into question just the arbitrariness of like a day. Like what a day is. We go around. The Earth spins, but like that's seemingly arbitrary. So then what's a year? So then what's 2 years? What's 20 years? We don't know anything about time. It's like the most mysterious thing in the history of the world, literally. And you wonder how the past is really truly affecting the present. The way that our biology pulls things from what happened earlier, or the idea of things being haunted, or just the idea that things never end. Like everything is just absorbed, everything just grows from itself, and is always in us. There's like, weird theories that are like, we know how to grow our own limbs if we could access that in our minds, like we have that information. So, to think about, the consequences of slavery, the consequences of oppression in those terms is like devastating. And so to me, the film sort of speaks to the idea that, you know, your mom passed away 4 years ago. Shouldn't you be you should be a little bit better, or that happened back then, don't worry about it, in whatever sense, whether or not it's, you know, your dog passing away or something positive happening. It just doesn't quite sit well with me. And so I tried in the film to speak to the relative nature of time, the relative nature of memory, the relative nature of the passing of, the cycle of, you know, of breathing in some sense. So the film is 5 years, and it's compressed into 12 to 10 days, 10 to 12 days. So the entire film's edited from sunup to sundown. So it's literally a kind of journey through a wildly long period of time in an intensely short period of time through time-based moments, you know.
I have more questions, but I want to make sure. With the hat.
I wanted to ask you about some of the scenes, like with Kyrie running around and then the bee and the leaves. They were very manic scenes. So I want to know what was the meaning below those scenes, because like she kept running and it was cute, but then there was a moment where I kind of felt like physically uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So can you kind of talk a little bit about that?
You know, I'm glad you used such a strong adjective as manic. Because, no, and like in a good way. Like I think like the film is literally built with it's built from my perspective and from my team's perspective, but it's not built in any way aside from the way in which you interpret it. You know, I've had people say that scene was like the most beautiful because that's just like my child. You know, and then there's a manicness in the way in which you saw it for God knows whatever reason, but. To me, I'm interested in making images and making films in which it's almost unfair the multiplicity of viewpoints or the multiplicity of interpretations of something, specifically as it relates to the Black experience and the Black body, in order to force someone to sort of confront the way in which they view and they've experienced a Black person, the Black body, and just sort of things in general. It's, you know, film should be a mirror. It shouldn't be something that you read necessarily. I think it should be an experiential mirror in which you're taking somewhere and you look. But in terms of those types of scenes, what I was interested in, I'm interested in like looking long enough to go through that full range of joy, discomfort, confusion, dismissal, you know, new attention, like new observations, because, you know, there's like a, and I say this a lot, but I think it's important. You know, like when you're sort of looking at words for a really long time, and like sort of disintegrates, and then you're like, oh my God, what's a letter? Like, what's this? Like, this just like doesn't make any sense. And then all of a sudden you snap into it, and you're like, oh, it's the word the, ha ha ha. Like that's because, you know, we've created a structure, like a system, you know, for meaning. But very rarely do people sort of look at people long enough for that to happen. Almost never. For like the sort of social constructions, the nose, the face, the eyes, the shirts, to sort of disintegrate and to just be there with, one, the material of flesh, two, then the next thing is just the human, and then like you can continue to rebuild what a person is, and then you realize that you've been taught and you're really comfortable thinking of people in really specific ways for the needs of society. This is a necessary thing. And so a lot of the way in which I was using the camera, like in that scene, is just like, just literally just looking, you know, and just watching and seeing what happens. And sometimes you'll get lucky enough to be able to find a moment like Kyrie that can translate to an audience. Most of the time it's just like, it's like unusable stuff because it's literally just looking at something, you know, and it's more for me than it would be for an audience. But that was like my interest in that scene. That scene is super open. I've heard people say, I can't believe that Kyrie is a special needs child. And I'm like, oh, I can't believe that he is either. Like, oh, whoa. You know, because their relationship with, I assume, their relationship with looking at Black kids being crazy and being wild and, you know, not speaking correctly is one of someone who's just not gonna cut it. Like, they're just not gonna make it, or they need some help or something. So that's kind of that part.
I like what you said earlier about portraits sort of being a reflection of the photographer. A lot of the time, Munoz talks about every portrait's a two-sided performance.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious about how Quincy, Kyrie, and everyone in the film responded to the film, what they think you were doing, like who you are to them now.
Yeah.
I'm also curious on the flip side of that, what it was like having a Pisha Tlong or Cool as like your advisor, this amazing Thai filmmaker who's, I don't know how many times has been to Alabama or been in these worlds that you have in front of your camera, but I'm curious about those two looking. So them looking at you and him looking at you and your material.
Yeah. Good questions. Yours were good too.
Also, in the email that you didn't respond to, I asked you about a picture poem.
You did?
Yes, and I was like, how is he a producer on your film? So you got to answer that.
I will take a bathroom break and respond to it and come back just to make amends.
Thank you. That's a big shout out to Peach. I'm sorry.
He's the man.
Yeah.
So I think one reason why the film is what it is, you know, a lot of people ask about access, and I'm like, well, I've never thought about access before. I lived there for 3 years, and I knew, and Quincy came through the program that I was teaching in, so I knew him through that. I met Daniel at the high school when I was coaching, and so I was in that community as a community like leader, sort of community activist, you know, trying to get people to vote, trying to get people back in school, trying to help them with their resumes, like all of the things that, you know, we think that we need to help people with, which I think is really important. But so they've always seen me as a sort of altruist or a sort of social do-gooder that was good at basketball, which was why I had a lot of clout in the community, gonna be honest. And then what? And then as a person that always took photos. Like I was always making photos and always like interested in photographing people, but those weren't first by any means. And so Daniel and Quincy see me as a person they really see me as a person that helps people. When someone needs help, they tell me that the person needs help or something, and then, you know, I see if there's anything I can do to you know, help them get a job or whatever. But when they saw the film, what were they? I don't really have words for it because I think, imagine living, and this is maybe me overemphasizing the rawness, but I think there's some truth to it. Imagine living in a place in which you don't come in contact with as many people as you come in contact with on a daily basis. Like you see tons of people, you like brush shoulders with them, you can get on a bus, you can go to the store. Like the small town of Alabama is just like, there's just not a lot of people. And so what's reflected even further when you're sort of disenfranchised is that like there's not a lot of attention being paid to you. There's not a lot of like literal communication. And so to me, what I noticed most profoundly when they saw the film was that like, I think they were just in awe at the scale and how they've gone from that, this is unconscious for them, I think, to like a screen at Sundance in which there's 500 people clapping and like crying, you know, when emotional moments happen. And I think it was a little overwhelming because, you know, and the goal of the film was to like elevate them in the community to sort of cinema, to the canon and whatnot. But I can't imagine what that would feel like, you know? I'm sure that it's uncomfortable, but I also know that it's been a great experience for them. We had a screening for the first time in Birmingham about a month ago and brought up like 15 of the folks from the film and some from the community. And they were all laughing at all of the parts that no one else would laugh at. And they were talking to each other when, you know, somebody did something. It was like really beautiful. And, you know, I was obviously nervous just because no one had seen it aside from Quincy Daniel, but they were floored, and they loved it. And Apishapong, yeah, so he's never been to Alabama, I don't think. I don't even know if he's never been to the States. He's only seen, the relationship between him and the film has been through edits that we would send him, and then he would sort of send back notes. He worked with Jocelyn Barnes, the lead producer on the film, and so she thought that he would be attracted to the sort of the goals and the aesthetic, which he was, and then we started to communicate about it. And so we would send him an edit, and he would send it back, and it would be really short, succinct interpretations of what he saw, and if it was sort of matching what we wanted to happen. And so I think his masterness was best displayed through his capacity to it's really hard to say what something is, that's one of the hardest things ever, in a universal way. And he can he said to Zima once, I was like, oh, this whole movement here is just touch, action, and whimsicality or something, and then being able to frame it through someone who sees things in the way in which he sees it allows you to access the stuff that you're doing in a different way. So that was kind of the relationship. It was incredibly helpful, and yeah, I wish I was better friends with him. I wish we had spent some time getting drinks.
So my question is, were there at any moment during the filming and putting it together, were there pieces of anyone's narrative that you made a decision to leave out in order to sort of not allow the audience to further a sort of myopic view of blackness? You have to make that distinction, that sacrifice at any point.
Oof, that's the nature of the film, my friend. That's 1,300 hours. It's 1,300 hours into that. So, the capacity for a person to connect, for a black person to be stereotyped is pretty high, just because it's to me, it's almost the one of the condemnations of the visual issue is that this easy readings. You show a black person with a gun, it's a stereotype. But black people have guns. Who cares? I mean, you should care, in certain situations, obviously. But I mean, in the South, it just veers a conversation. So, to me, actually, you know what? I would use quote unquote. It's such a complicated thing because a stereotype of a black person could be wearing one of those fitted caps, right? I think at least. But if the person is doing something that is offset from what is traditionally depicted of a black person, then that doesn't become the focus of the image, and that stereotype becomes sort of almost slides into a greater moment. You know what I mean? So I guess what I'm trying to say is what's most important to me is filming and showing images or doing things. To me, the reason why the film could do some of that stuff is because I spent enough time with them to let things happen that are not as performative, right? If you are making a documentary film, you have a budget, you have 2 hours to shoot this day, and so you're looking for stuff to show, to prove your thesis or to execute all of your ideas. And so one, there's another consumption in there. The other is that it's just incredibly reductive. So to me, spending time finding that moment that is sort of unchoreographable, something that's unpredictable, whimsical, magical, just this conflation of so many different things that has symbolic value, interpretative value, was what I was interested in. And then everything else, regardless of whether or not it was a stereotype, wasn't interesting to me because to me, building a film out of that whimsicality is just what I was interested in. There's more to say about that, but I think it's a bad time. It's a good question.
And we also have to wrap it up now.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, there's a screening here at 9:30. Let's give RaMell another round of applause. Thank you.